Hi there, Dan Scott here. I'm going to show you how I painted this seascape using mostly palette knives and oil paints. I took the photo at Byron Bay in New South Wales, Australia. We were there back in January to celebrate Chontele and my 10-year anniversary. This painting will be a pleasant reminder of that trip. I start by staining the surface with transparent oxide brown. This kills the white and gives me a more balanced surface to paint on. I don't have any particular reason for using transparent oxide brown for the stain, other than it being a fairly dark and restrained colour in terms of saturation. I then roughly sketch the major shapes and lines. Nothing detailed, I'm just trying to get a feel for the composition and where everything will go. With the palette knife, I mark the far edge of the ocean. This will represent the horizon line. The palette knife is handy for this, given its ability to create clean, straight edges. It's important that this line is straight and flat, as I won't be able to get away with a crooked or slanted horizon line. I then work my way down through the rest of the ocean. As I look at the reference photo, I try to see the subject as an arrangement of basic shapes and colours. I don't want to get lost in the tiny details just yet. It may look a bit abstract at the moment, but I'm trusting that it will all make more sense once all the pieces are in place. This is one of the tricky aspects of painting. Often the painting will look wrong until all the pieces are in place and you're able to view it as a whole. Up until that point, you need to have some trust in the process and your judgment. For the crashing waves and whitewash, I basically want a fairly weak and light blue colour. I go with Cobalt Blue, Titanium White, and a touch of raw Umber to reduce the saturation. The key here is not to make the colour too light. When painting white or near white objects like this, they tend to appear lighter than they really are. I continue down to the wet sand at the bottom. I use longer strokes and smoother texture here, as I want to convey the flat and smooth nature of the wet sand. The difference in texture helps create some distinction between the sand and the body of water. I approach the sand as two segments. First, the blue area, which is mostly reflecting the colours of the open sky. Second, the area around the middle that's reflecting the clouds. For the blue area, the key feature is that gradation from a light blue at the top to dark ultramarine blue around the bottom. For the area reflecting the clouds, I use lighter and warmer colours, mostly weak purples and yellows. Usually I would paint the sky first and then the reflections, but there's no set process here, and I often just follow my gut as to how I work my way through a painting. I move up to the sky and start mapping out the dark parts of the clouds. I need to be careful here not to mess up the horizon line along the ocean. I use the palette knife to gently push the purple colours down to meet the dark blue ocean colours. For the light parts of the clouds, I use a mix of Naples yellow with titanium white and a touch of the purple to reduce the saturation. I want the lights to pop, but not overpower the painting, so I don't want the lights to be too light or saturated. I then use an intermediate colour to ease the transition between the highlights and the shadows. This makes the clouds appear softer and more realistic. If the edge between light and shallow is too hard, it would make the clouds appear too rigid and geometric. For the open sky, I use Cobalt Blue plus lots of Titanium White, and I work this colour around the clouds. It's amazing how much the blue sky transforms the painting and makes everything read better. This is what I meant before when I mentioned how sometimes you need all the pieces in place before you can really judge the painting and make good decisions. around the light parts of the clouds, I keep the edges fairly hard and distinct, whereas around the dark parts, I use softer edges and work the light blue into the dark purple a bit. This creates a subtle link between the clouds and the rest of the sky. I then use a bit of the light blue colour to lighten parts of the wet sand and push the value contrast a bit. When painting reflections like this, you'll often see me jump back and forth between the subject and its reflection to ensure they fit together. I use my finger here to add a strong burst of light around this peak of the cloud. Before it was looking a bit vague and wispy. I also make sure to mirror this in its reflection on the wet sand. Notice how I didn't add more paint to my finger when going from the cloud at the top to its reflection at the bottom. This ensures the first mark I made was stronger and cleaner than the second mark. This is important as I don't want the reflections to overpower the real thing. I paint in the light areas of these 3 smaller clouds on the right hand side. There's an interesting sense of balance here with the 3 small clouds on one side and the large feature cloud on the other side. It works well in terms of composition and design. Now all the colours are roughly blocked in, and what I'm left with is a fairly decent foundation to work with. What I'm looking for at this early stage of the painting is that it broadly resembles the subject, and that no fundamental mistakes jump out at me. For example, if the sky were too dark, or if the horizon line were crooked, now would be the time to fix it. These fundamental mistakes only get worse as the painting progresses. But in this case, nothing jumps out at me and it broadly reads true. So from here, I need to clean it up a bit and make sure it all works together as a whole. I start by better articulating the waves and the edges of the water. I use a dark bluish green for this, basically a mix of Ultramarine Blue and Viridian Green. These dark lines do a lot of the heavy moving in terms of transforming the abstract colour shapes into waves and water. I then start to pick up some of the lighter colours on the water just in front of the crashing waves. These areas are flatter and reflect more of the sky colours. These are tricky colours to get right. They need to be just a touch lighter than the crashing waves, but not too light. I continue adding lighter colours to the rest of the ocean. It's all a bit dark at the moment. As I add these colours, I'm thinking about 2 things. First, the overall arrangement of light and dark shapes. This is important as it keeps the painting structured and organised. Second, the general flow and movement of the water. I may be painting from a photo, but I don't want my painting to feel like a static picture. I want to convey the water's movement, the crashing waves, the ripples and whitewash, the push and pull of the ocean. So I try to have these ideas in my mind as I paint, and I let them gently guide my brush. On the wet sand, I use a few dark lines to suggest ridges in the water as it pushes up and retreats over the sand. I then add a few lighter colours to match the sky. The rest of the painting is really just tinkering and trying to get the water and the waves right. This wave around the middle is tricky. I struggled to make it stand out whilst also fitting in with the surroundings. I do a lot of trial and error to find my way through. This is not an efficient way to work, but it's often necessary. I use palette knives for almost all of this painting, but I do swap to a brush on a few occasions to tidy things up. Here I use a small round brush to clean up the water a little bit. Then I go around and push up the lights a touch. I want there to be a fairly strong contrast between light and shadow. This is what will give the painting that nice pop. A subtle but interesting detail of this subject is the rainbow around the middle of the sky. To paint the rainbow, I let the painting dry for about a day, and then I use a flat brush to gently scumble colour over the surface. I basically pick up a hint of colour on the brush and gently drag it over the surface. First cadmium red, then cadmium yellow, then emerald green. I want hints of pure and saturated colour. The key here is not to do too much. The rainbow shouldn't be something that steals the show, but rather is an interesting detail that you notice after a while. To finish up, I go around with a brush and scumble highlights and dark accents over the dry surface. The idea is to pick up some of the flickering highlights and shadows that the palette knife may have missed. I sign the painting in the bottom right hand side using cadmium red and a small round brush. Cadmium red contrasts nicely against the surrounding cool colours and adds a burst of warmth. That's it for this painting. Here it is alongside the reference photo. Keep in mind, the reference photo was just a guide. What I really wanted to capture through this painting was how I first experienced the scene there on the beach. And I think this painting does a pretty good job of it. I'll put a link to the reference photo in the description below the video in case you want to paint it for yourself. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.